Come join me today as I hibernate from the summer heat and adjust an old green dress, mend an apron, bake bread, harvest vegetables from the garden, and meet Mrs Trollope back in Little Thatchbridge for another short story. There's a glitter of gold, a flutter of white, and a dash of deep red rose petals. Little butterflies cover the ground in a carpet of cut-out paper. Every so often they burst to life, chasing each other in circles, round and round, swirling and cartwheeling. They lie dormant on the pavement stones, the whimsical discarded remnants of a summer's wedding, until the wind comes in to beckon them away. The summer garden is bursting with vibrant colours. Tomatoes are everywhere and falling off the vines, each morning bringing more and more of the red blushed fruit. Aubergines, both the white and the purple variety, sit happily under the shade of their large leaves. They watch the tomatoes multiply with endless amusement. The basil grows tall and bushy, its leaves multiplying without end, and the chives bring forth their flowers, little black seeds falling into the earth as the breeze rustles. The ants scurry about and the wasps buzz in menacing circles, making nuisances of themselves as always. Each day brings more summer bounty from the garden. Somewhere in my cupboard was an old dress, muted green and covered with white roses. It has sat there for years, unused and never worn. It's hard to say exactly why the dress was never worn. The flower print was perhaps just too big, or the lines of the dress unflattering, or it was simply just too much green. I don't know exactly which of those reasons made the dress look strange on me, but all in all, it was something I did not wear. That changes today. Today I will turn the old dress into something I will enjoy wearing. It's been a while since we journeyed back to Little Thatchbridge, and after looking at the dress, I immediately thought of Mrs Trollope. Not just because of her love of sewing and patchwork, but because there was something about the shade of green, about the roses that were entwined in the pattern, something about that matched Mrs Trollope's vibe. I thought it would be fun to explore a scene from her story a bit further back in time than we usually see her, when her daughter Natasha was little, and what better dress for Mrs Trollope to make than a party frock for her daughter. Natasha's Party Dress, a short story by Ida Williams. Little Thatchbridge, the year 1919. Try to hold still, darling. You keep bouncing up and down. I can't help it, Mummy. The little girl grinned, swaying from side to side, and the three-legged stool she stood on, rocking ever so slightly with each movement. Standing in the middle of their small living room, as the afternoon sun filtered in through the bay window, Natasha was having her final fitting. It's going to be the best party. They're going to have cake and scones and jam. I told Felly to ask for strawberry jam. Natasha flicked her curly black hair over her shoulder, which held back was making its usual bid for freedom. I had to make sure she knew that, Mummy, because some people serve gooseberry jam with scones. Mrs Trollope looked up from her position kneeling on the floor, pincushion in one hand and the hem of her daughter's new party dress in the other. No, not gooseberry jam, she replied, matching her daughter's serious tone, and raised an eyebrow in amusement. Natasha leaned forward, lowering her voice, ready to impart a great secret. Felly didn't know you must have strawberry, so I told her so. Felly said that when the bishop comes, they have scones with gooseberry jam served in the library. Natasha dramatically shuddered again. I would rather be in school than eat gooseberry jam with my scones. Mrs Trollope looked down to hide her smile and turned up the next section of the hem. Indeed, please try to stay still, not long now. Natasha fell silent for a bit, wondering if the vicar's collar was too tight. He always looked stiff and uncomfortable. Maybe that made him like gooseberry jam. Then she thought of something that chased away unfortunate jam flavours. Something even more important than scones. We're also going to have ice cream. Cake, scones, and ice cream? My, what a feast. Natasha nodded happily. Of course, it's Felly's birthday. You must have cake, scones, and ice cream. It was a miracle that Felicity Cove was having a party in the first place. Often confined to her bed or the sofa, at the grand old age of 13, this would be her first birthday party, and most of the village was invited. Did you know we were having ice cream, Mummy? I think so. Do you know what flavour? Felly said it was a surprise. Is it vanilla, or strawberry, or chocolate? Wait for the party, then you'll see. Mrs Trollope continued pinning, eyeing up the sides of the dress to keep the hem straight. Having volunteered to bake the scones, she knew all the behind the scenes of the party. The whole ordeal may have proven far too much for Felicity's mother. Mrs Cove was already showing extreme signs of nervous exhaustion. Mrs Trollope had no worries for Felicity. Although pale and small, The vicar's daughter would undoubtedly benefit from an afternoon of fun, and she was very patient with all the little children. Her frazzled mother, on the other hand, may need a month's rest just to begin to recover. Mrs. Cove had spent the last 2 weeks hurrying around in a constant state of panic, steadily loathing the idea of her orderly vicarage being turned upside down by so many guests. Among her concerns were drafts coming in from the open doors and windows, mud being tracked in by unruly children, and punch being spilt on the sideboard. There were other small and increasingly insignificant worries as well, but somewhere in the frizzle, Mrs. Trollope had lost track. She had fixed the issue of mud-stained carpets by suggesting that all party guests remove their shoes at the front door, only to be then presented with a new problem. Without shoes, the children would be at risk of stubbing their toes. Or what if they got cold in only their socks? What if they didn't wear socks? Mrs. Trollope would be glad when the whole affair was behind them, as such a never-ending list of problems was becoming harder and harder to solve. At least Natasha's dress was working out well. Mrs. Trollope observed her handiwork with satisfaction. The cotton had the colour of dark green pine trees, and white roses interweaved themselves across its surface. Very nearly finished, darling. We're going to play games in the study. Oh, do you think they'll have musical chairs? Without pausing to hear a reply, as her question was more of a passing thought than something she needed an answer to, Natasha continued along. I hope they do. I am very good at musical chairs, aren't I, Mummy? No one is quick like me. Mrs. Trollope placed another pin, replying carefully, Do try not to push people again. Natasha jerked her head up with a sharp and rather theatrical cry of anguish. Oh, Mummy, not that. She folded her arms. I didn't touch him. He fell on his own. Mrs. Trollope stayed silent and let her daughter continue in her self-defence. It was easier with Natasha to sometimes let things run their course. As she had not been present at the time of the alleged pushing, there was not much she could say. Natasha went on explaining in great detail how she could not have pushed him, and the scolding by the adults was entirely unjust. The closing point ended on the indisputable fact that Morrison's fall was entirely Morrison's fault. He had to cry like a baby, and you know why? Natasha scowled as the events of the last birthday party played themselves over in her mind, every moment vivid, solid, and naturally 100% accurate. Well, Mummy? No need to raise your voice, I'm right here. Mummy doesn't want to prick you by accident. Mrs. Trollope carefully held the dress's hem out to check the positioning of both sides. The right still felt a little bit long. Why do you think baby Morrison cried? I don't know, and he's not a baby, he's almost as old as you. Natasha scoffed. The 6 months that separated her and Morrison stretched infinitely. She was, after all, 8, and he was only 7. Perhaps more importantly, though, it was the events of that party that made Morrison firmly, forever, an incurable infant, and eternally her enemy. He cried, Natasha explained slowly for the benefit of her mother, who did not seem to grasp the gravity of the situation, because he wanted more ice cream. He sat on the floor and cried, got all red and everything. Then it happened. Natasha paused, her brow lining deeply. He got a whole bowl of ice cream, double scoops and double strawberries. And I got scolded by Mrs. Jones, and I had to sit in the corner for 10 whole minutes. I'm sure he didn't do that on purpose. Maybe... No, Mummy, Natasha didn't stamp her foot or raise her voice. For all the dramatics of her earlier retelling, she now stood completely still and her voice level. Mrs. Trollope looked up and found her daughter's round face and dark eyes looking gravely down at her. I was running quickly and we all bumped into each other getting onto the chairs, but I did not push him. He made it look like it. There was something desperate in the way Natasha spoke. Her voice remained neutral and her body language calm, but deep down from her core came bubbling up an extreme need to be believed, and it shone out like a piercing light through her dark brown, almost black eyes. I believe you, Mrs. Trollope replied quietly, pushing down a lump in her throat. Now, what do you think of your dress? Turning her little girl around to face the mirror, she pushed Natasha's curly hair back once again from her shoulders. The party dress had come out beautifully, a wide layered skirt, puffy sleeves, and matching buttons running down the front. As a final touch, all the edges were trimmed with a cream lace. Natasha broke into a wide smile, her voice returning to its regular high pitch. Oh, Mummy, it's beautiful, she grinned, shaking and wiggling the puffy skirt. It is the most beautiful dress I've ever seen. I thought so as well, replied her mother softly. Come, take it off and I'll sew in the hem. Natasha quickly disrobed and pulled her regular blue smock dress over her head again. Can I run round to tell Felly, please? Of course, don't be too long, supper will be ready soon. With a clatter down the back stairs and a slam of the door, Natasha disappeared, running down the cobblestones of the village street to the vicarage nearby. Left alone in their small flat above the post office, Mrs. Trollope traced her fingertips across the fabric. It was the loveliest dress. It had always been so, from the day she first saw it in the Paris shop. It had taken quite a bit of careful thought to turn her old dress into one for Natasha, but she had made it work. Before it had been an Edwardian-style morning dress, and now in its place stood a child's party frock and a handful of green scraps. It was a fitting change for a dress that she didn't wear anymore. The fashions had certainly changed, and so had life. A water droplet hit the surface of the fabric, and then another reluctantly followed. Natasha had looked so much like her father in that one instant of quiet desperation. Ella slipped easily back through time to another moment years before. She remembered the look, the stillness that had fallen over Natasha's father, the almost world-ending seriousness reflected in his eyes, and that same overwhelming need for trust. She allowed herself a rare moment to dwell in the past. It was not something she permitted very often. The present held too much to do. There was supper to make, a hem to sew, and not to mention a large batch of scones to bake for the next day. But for a moment she let that wait, and Mrs. Prunella Trollope cried softly into her daughter's party dress. The end.
Open up the window. I'm breathing in the last of September. I can feel the wind blow, and the late summer sky is like a giant ember. Everything is turning into gold. When the autumn leaves are playing chase, it puts a smile up on my face. They leave their branches one by one and whirl around there just for fun. Some are faster, some are slow, and some are high and some are low, dancing through the last days of September. Since I was a little child, every year for as long as I remember, all the leaves were running wild, going all the way until November. Turn the world around us into gold. When the autumn leaves are playing chase, it puts a smile up on my face. They leave their branches one by one and whirl around there just for fun. Some are faster, some are slow, and some are high and some are low, dancing through the last days of September. I wonder where they're going, the flight of swallows sailing through the sky. There's no way of knowing, but maybe someplace far from you and I. When the autumn leaves are playing chase, it puts a smile up on my face. They leave their branches one by one and whirl around there just for fun. Some are faster, some are slow, and some are high and some are low, dancing through the last days of September. When the autumn leaves are playing chase, it puts a smile up on my face. They leave their branches one by one and whirl around there just for fun. Some are faster, some are slow, and some are high and some are low, dancing through the last days of September. Dancing through the last days of September.
There is a small black work apron, long used and stained. Nothing could get the stains out. No amount of soaking or scrubbing, miracle detergents or age-old recipes. The stains were there to stay. Stubborn, resolute, and definitely an eyesore. As the sewing machine was out and the summer afternoon heat lingered outside, I decided to tackle another project on my mending list and rescue the little apron. After carefully observing the problem areas, I decided that the apron ties would be saved and a new front panel would be inserted. Gone would be the black apron with its unmoving stains. the old fabric destined to be placed into the scrap pile and used in small pieces elsewhere. The stitches that held the old apron onto the ties were carefully unpicked. Stitch by stitch, the seam ripper travelled efficiently. A selection of pretty fabrics were brought forth in their basket. Small pieces with delicate patterns, pink cherry blooms and tiny yellow flowers, white daisies and lines of text. Joining the fabric was an assortment of lace, a metre of buttery cream and a roll of snowy white. Collectively, they formed a pile of little scraps and offcuts, ready to be sewn together. The outline of the old panel was traced and a new one quickly sewn. Daisies and text and a line of lace formed the layers. Fabric was cut, pins placed, and the seams ironed. The hum of the sewing machine filled the room as the afternoon sun shone down outside and the chorus of summer crickets loudly sung from the grasses. The Granny Square blanket project is moving on to the next step as I have been playing around with the placement of my colours and looking for a pattern. I talked about this project in the last video and decided on an autumnal colour palette of mustard yellow, burgundy, beige and brown. Sometimes the best way for me to decide on the placement of colours is to draw them out. Pull out some paints or pens and colour away. It gives a rough idea of how things will look and makes decisions easier. The pattern I ended up using is a combination of different YouTube tutorials for African flower granny squares. I practiced a couple of different methods and experimented on my own a bit until I found a combination of rows that I liked. I also used a couple of different sizes of crochet hooks, making the same pattern a couple of times to see which of the finished fabrics I liked most. These long-term projects require planning and testing and experimenting a bit before I actually start work on the main bulk of the project. Very much like my novels, I like to have an outline or a roadmap before I write the story. A granny square blanket is no different. There is of course always room for variation and adjustment as I go. For example, I have not quite decided yet exactly how large I want the finished blanket to be. I will just use the yarn that I have and see how many squares that makes, and then buy more yarn if necessary. Until then, I will use what I have, and now that I have decided on the colours, the pattern, the placement of those colours and the hook size, I can begin to crochet. I hope you enjoyed joining Mrs Trollope for another Little Thatchbridge story today. It's been a while since I went back to the village, and it's always fun to spend some time there. I have set up a page over on the website for the Little Thatchbridge stories, so if you want to view the ones written so far, you can find them all in one place. I will also be working on adding some character pages and a timeline for the stories as well. The green dress was an interesting project to sew, as I was working within the constraints of a pre-made garment. I feel there was less pressure on this project, probably because I couldn't make it any less wearable than it already was, and that was quite freeing. In the end, I decided to cut the dress simply in half, to make a skirt and a cropped, short sleeve jacket type thing. I love the layers of lace that I added around the bottom of the skirt and the sleeves of the top. I really enjoy wearing these pieces of clothing now. The skirt in particular is easy to mix and match with different tops. I might also add a little ribbon to the insides of the skirt at some point in the future, as the edges of the lace are a little bit scratchy. But apart from that, mission successful. I think Mrs Trollope would approve of my garment transformation, although it's definitely not as beautiful as Natasha's party dress was. Thank you for watching today's episode. If you're new, welcome, my name is Ida. On this channel I share short stories from the world of Meadow Afternoon, along with the behind the scenes of my novels, a little bit of slow living, cooking and crafting. If you'd like to learn more about the world of Meadow Afternoon, you can find a link to my website below. Feel free to say hello in the comments and please consider subscribing so you don't miss the next issue of Meadow Afternoon. Until next time.